second what we will be doing, what kind of lectures, what kind of activities. But why don't you tell me what your names are? William, with you, please.
Sure, yeah, I'm William DeMayo.
William, right?
Elizabeth McDonald.
Elizabeth, pleasure to meet you. I already met Paul.
Yes, hello.
Hello, Dmitry.
Say again.
Dmitry.
Nice to meet you guys. I already met some of you, right?
Nikolai.
Nikolai,
Sophia.
Sophia.
Anika.
Nice to meet you.
Sasha.
Sasha.
I am Nazar Ibrahimov.
First name is
Nazar.
Zar. Okay. Good to meet you. And we already met Semyon and I.
Alexander Pushkin.
Pushkin.
Точно.
That's great. Well, we will meet from what I understand 10 times. I have
So we're picking slides number 1, right?
it is number 1, right?
Okay.
Number 1. I'm not sure if we move again. Azar was doing a good job of covering the with his back the flash. I feel like a movie star. You move it just a little bit. All right. And what I'd like to do is to talk to you, to teach a course on Russia in Asia-Pacific region, concentrating on several aspects of it, on several activities. At some point, I will ask for all of your email addresses, because we will have some discussions as well. We have 10 times allocated for us to meet. Only 6 of them will be lectures. And even when I teach, even when I lecture, I really would love to hear from you. I would love to have any reactions you might have. And I'll have sometimes questions for you. If you have questions for me, that's great. And we will also have twice, we will meet for discussion. First discussion will be based on 4 lectures that I will give. And I will send you some readings, which is why I need your email addresses. Probably we will meet for discussion the way I tentatively schedule it. First discussion will be on Wednesday, because we have 2 lectures scheduled today and then 2 others tomorrow. So Wednesday is going to be a good time for us to meet for discussion. And then there will be one other lecture on Thursday, and another one, the last one, on Friday. And on Friday also we will have a discussion of the last 2 lectures, 5 and 6. And we have 2 more meetings on Saturday. And Tamara Gavrilovna asked me, and I'm happy to do this, to talk to you about a research project. What does it take to do a research project? What are some of the pitfalls, some of the problems involved? Could be a research paper, it could be more than that. What are some of the problems? Essentially, what do you do if you want to write a publishable paper? What is it that you would be able to do with the material? How you organize the material? This is what we call a research design type of lecture. I teach a class at San-Francisco State on research design and foreign policy, and so that's one of the things that we do there. So that would be another meeting on Saturday, and then we'll also have the overall discussion of the course. I understand that this material is somewhat useful to you for your papers. Do you have exams? What is it that you have as the culminating experience for this class? Exam. All right. So then we can talk about whatever questions you might have based on this material. For other classes here, I also talk about possible topics of papers, курсовые работы for them, because students are looking for topics, and that would be an opportunity for you also to ask any questions you have for me on session. So that's a tentative plan. And the structure of these 6 lectures is, I think, straightforward. Today, let's talk about ideas and interests, ideas in foreign policy and foreign policy interests. Then tomorrow, energy and human security. Energy economics 1 lecture, another one is human security. And we will then conclude by 2 other lectures, one on politics, political institutionalization, political stability and instability in the region, and another one is military security. And that's the course. So it's broad enough, I hope, to accommodate some of your questions, some of your interests, and it also is something that interests me. I do want to emphasize that I am not an Asia-Pacific region expert. My research is primarily on Russian foreign policy formation and Russian foreign policy as a global phenomenon. So I want to look at the Asia-Pacific region in that context. Asia-Pacific not per se, but as a very important component of Russia's global strategy, of Russia's global foreign policy. And I think it's a great case, so to speak, to look at the Asia-Pacific region, particularly northern Eastern European part of it. We won't be able to cover all the directions, but whenever we discuss energy, for example, obviously we must pay attention to Russia's energy policy in some other directions, because Asia-Pacific aspect of it is a necessary part of the overall strategy. You can't understand the diversification aspect of it without paying attention to European pipelines, for example. So that's essential. And that will be the emphasis. Today, for instance, let's talk about ideas. In international relations theories, as you may know, there is a theory called constructivism. And that's what I would like to talk about today. Constructivism in foreign policy, specifically the role of ideas, and obviously Russia has been debating the so-called national idea for centuries, so I think it's befitting that we discuss that aspect. And then the next lecture today also is about the drivers in Russian foreign policy, and how these drivers shape, inform, constrain, and facilitate whatever Russia is doing in foreign policy. And then we'll move and amplify these to energy and human security tomorrow. Yes, I think tomorrow is the time when we talk about this. And what I will try to do also is to send you these readings already tomorrow morning. I have a window tomorrow morning. So if I could ask you to write down your email addresses for me on a piece of paper, send it around, and then I'll have a list constructed at home, and I'll be able to send you these readings electronically, so you have them on your computer, and then we'll be able to meet. For instance, today we'll talk about Asia-Pacific Russia as a concept, and Euro-Asia-Pacific Russia as a concept. And there is a specific author who introduced this notion of Euro-Asia-Pacific Russia, Dmitry Klenin. And there is an article that he wrote about this 10 years ago, and that's the one that I wanted to read before we have a discussion. So that's just to give you an example. But today, that's the topic. And should I tell you, Simon, to go to the next slide? Can we do it this way? These are the questions for you. Any questions? First, let's talk about formation of foreign policy from constructivist perspective. Let me ask you, how much of an international relations theory background do you have? I'm just curious if you had any international relations theory classes before you had. Okay, so have you covered realism, liberalism debate there? Have you talked specifically about what types of realism exist? Different schools of realism, structural realism, is that a familiar term, neorealism? Okay, all right, good. And a little bit of constructivism as well, or is this new? Okay. Well, as you remember, that's a quick summary. In foreign policy, there is a baseline. In any international relations subject, there is a baseline. There is a baseline in just about anything that we do in all human activities. Writers have particular standards, artists have particular standards, and in international relations they have their own baseline, their own standard theory, and that's political realism. Theory that emphasizes material capabilities, power, security, alliances. That's what matters to realists. The key point for them is that a state must protect itself in a very unpredictable international system. A system in which there are no rules, the system in which there is no legitimacy. It's a system that is called and described by realists with the concept of anarchy. Right? That's what's important for realists. Then liberals, and if you are done with these questions, we can turn to slide 3, please. Thank you so much. For liberals, what matters frequently is individual rights, and for states, some positive example for modernization. Sometimes democratization, sometimes economic modernization. And the question still is how to act on these interests and capabilities. If you have a certain amount of capabilities in the world, if you have, for example, sufficient amount of nuclear power, what do you do with this type of weapons, right? What do you do with these institutions that you have? How do you project certain policies? And that raises the question of a vision. That raises the question of idea. That raises the question of how a nation visualizes itself and then projects itself into the world. And that's what constructivism is interested in. It is interested in power, but in social terms, in ideational terms. It is interested in how a particular idea, particular identity gets established, and then how that idea shapes our concept of interest. So it brings together history and domestic context, right? Because constructivism oftentimes builds on psychological theories, and that means that who you are is more important than what you want. And before you know what you want, you need to find out who you are. Your identity precedes your interests. That's a basic assumption of constructivism. And you can simply define constructivism as a theory of ideas and identity in world politics and in foreign policy as well. So, if that's who we are, if that's what identity is, that means that idea of a nation is, at least as important as your concept of interest, political interest. And in psychology, at least in some theories of psychology, there is an emphasis on self and other relationships. Self develops its identity through the other, through the significant other. And the simplest example is, of course, relationships between children and their parents. Right? Children grow and socialize by absorbing some of the key qualities from their parents. Their parents, therefore, are their significant others for quite some time until there are other significant others emerging, friends, peers. That's the world of social interactions, at least in terms of psychological insights. And to some extent, this can be applied to international politics as well. So what you have here is actually two rather than one important influences. One is the influence of the other, And the other one, the other influence is internal influences, experiences of the self, some life circumstances. And if you apply this to states, then you won't understand the impact of two factors. One is how the other, the state or the system of states or institutions, the region that you find particularly important, particularly attracted to, how that region shapes your identity. Does it accept you as a member, or does it reject you as unfit to be a part of this region? So you have testable hypothesis here, if you will. If your significant other accepts you, then you're more likely to organize your behavior in correspondence with this significant other. If you are a state, then if your significant other accepts you as a member of a regional community, then you're more likely to cooperate with that state. If, however, that other rejects you as a member, by explaining, for example, that your values are fundamentally different, then you are not likely to be as cooperative, others being equal, and that's influence one. And second influence has to do with your domestic circumstances, with your level of confidence. If you're confident enough, if you're strong enough, then even when you're rejected, you can still try to exercise relatively independent foreign policy. If you are not confident enough, then when you are rejected by your significant other, you're still not very likely to cooperate. If you have a previous history of developing significant identity of your own, you're more likely to pursue some sort of semi-isolationist foreign policy. And I'll give you examples. That's so much over here. So Simon, if we move to the next one. So that's all that I want to emphasize here, that there are two key influences. There are domestic conditions that describe relative confidence, and that identity in principle is not a fixed process. Identity is political, and so who we are is also something that can change. It can change in response to some international developments, and that's what psychologists describe with the notion of identity crisis, because we are constantly changing and reshaping our identity. And then, if you move to slide 5, it's a way to make sense of it visually. You have two influences, and if you need me to spell out, because I did abbreviate some words here, but essentially what I'm trying to emphasize here is two influences. One is international influence, and another one is local conditions. And then these two influences shape the dominant view of identity. For example, Russia is part of the West. If international influences are largely such that Russia is being accepted by the West, by Europe, during certain periods of time, then what is likely to happen in this case, that domestic view of national identity is going to be more favorable to the West. In this case, supportive coalition is going to be strengthened due to these influences, and you'll have so-called westernizers dominating the political scene. On the other hand, if the West is not like this, if the West is not receptive of Russia's interests and Russia's policies, then it's likely to be the case that a non-Western or even anti-Western coalition will dominate domestically. And eventually one of these coalitions will dominate the state, will inform state perception of national interests and foreign policy. And if you move to slide 6, then it's an illustration of you using Russia as an example. Ultimately, this is what we're here for. Right? The West has been significant other for Russia since some 16th century, some say earlier, some say later, and it's beginning to change today. The West, of course, has been a dominant civilization for some 300 years, and the choices are either to work with Russia or to pressure Russia to cooperate. And because Russia had its own pre-established historical sense of self, relatively independent self, it's not likely to yield to pressures. It will either develop assertive foreign policy, challenging the West, or if it's not strong enough, then it will go into relative isolation. Sometimes it's described with the word concentration, sometimes it's described with the word of defensive foreign policy. So you have essentially three choices when it comes to Russia's foreign policy. Either cooperation with the West, depending on how the West acts towards Russia, or assertive foreign policy with respect to the West, or defensive foreign policy, and the latter two choices are defined by Russia's domestic sense of confidence. And what you see here is also references to statists and civilizations. Right, these are the three schools that I'm introducing to you. Number one is westernizers. Number two is statists, those who emphasize Russia's political independence, Russia's sovereignty, geopolitical standing. So these are the attributes that realist in international relations theory emphasize. Russia as держава, right? That's why I call them in Russian державники. So you have западники, державники, and the third group are those who emphasize distinctiveness, uniqueness of Russia's values, of Russia's culture, not just of Russia's geopolitical interests and political interests and sovereignty, but also of Russian values. Eastern Christianity, for example, or special relationships with the non-Western worlds. We're talking about Eurasians, Russian nationalists, Eurasianists. These are typically groups that emphasize that Russia is unique and different from the West, not just in terms of its geopolitical priorities. Russia is a different civilization, which is why the word civilizationist comes into play. And if you move to the next slide, it will give you an idea of how Russia fluctuated based on these different images of self and different visions of the world, from Gorbachev to Putin 3.0, so to speak, right? Meaning that he served 2 terms and now is his 3rd term. And you can see that the relationships fluctuated quite a bit. For Mikhail Gorbachev, the world was in the Cold War crisis. There was no solution to it except to build a new concept of interest, something that he described with the notion of common human values, общие человеческие интересы, right? And so for him, new thinking and cross-cultural dialogue was something that was necessary for Russia to adopt as its interest, as its national interest. So as you can see, national interests change. They change in respect to the international environment. They change in respect to domestic challenges and how leaders then conceptualize these changes. They're not fixed. And that's something that is a challenge for geopolitical realism that always argues that interests are constant, and geographic and geopolitical constant. Then, of course, you remember the early 90s, the era of the so-called strategic partnership with the West. Boris Yeltsin and Andrei Kozyrev's desire to integrate with the West. The perception at the time was that the West effectively won the Cold War, that the West institutionally dominated the world. And so for Russia, it was essential to become part of the West, to integrate with the West. The Westernizers, the coalition of Westernizers in this case, prevailed and shaped the political discourse. Then there was a radical shift, very dramatic shift away from the discourse in response to several external and internal developments. When Evgeny Primakov came into the office as the second foreign minister, he brought with him a very different idea of what Russia was. It was the idea of Eurasian Trade Fund. It was the idea that he introduced in response to what he saw as the United States' tendency to dominate unipolarity and denying Russia its legitimate interests. So that was a very different time and very different concept of interest. And when Vladimir Putin comes into the office, the world changes again. And the challenges that he wants to emphasize have to do with economic modernization. Russia was lagging behind all the Western countries. And he wanted for Russia to modernize and to some degree to build more relationships and ties with the Western world. And the other challenge, of course, had to do with terrorism. Right? Even before September 11th, Russia was already suffering from terrorist activities in the Caucasus and elsewhere. So he went back to the idea of cooperation with the West, but it was not nearly as extensive as the cooperation as advanced by Andrei Cıgankov and Boris Yeltsin, which is why I call it, and this is the language that is used today, by the pragmatic cooperation. Pragmatic in the sense that it served state interests. The idea was not to fully integrate with the West. The idea was to use this cooperation to strengthen Russia's ability to be politically and economically strong. So it's a synthesis of Westernism and statism, Держава and the West at the same time. It's hard to deny that Putin is a Державник president. He certainly is. But at the same time, he favored and continues to favor strong relationships with Western European nations and with the United States to a less extent. Then we experience almost a deja vu, because Putin in this case, Putin 2.0 so to speak, revives the same concept of United States unilateralism that Evgeny Primakov was fond of in a different context. But this time, Russia is in a much stronger position. Russia in the year 2007, for example, which is when Vladimir Putin delivered his Munich speech, the toughest speech with critique of United States unilateralism, is not Russia of the 90s, right? It's a Russia that is far more confident, far more involved by economic reform, by growing oil prices. And this is the time when Putin pursues assertive foreign policy rather than cooperative foreign policy, in response to what he sees as the United States and Western Europe, the lack of acceptance of Russia's legitimate interest in foreign policy. When Dmitry Medvedev comes in for a few years, this is already after the Georgia war, right? This is after the global financial crisis. Russia doesn't feel as strong as it used to. It feels vulnerable. It feels necessary to engage with the West again. And then we also have to account for personalities. Medvedev and Putin are different types of personalities. They have different experiences. They have different backgrounds. And so Medvedev pursues with Putin's blessing. They have disagreements, but they also have some general and common views. A new engagement of the West. Still is an engagement with the idea of preserving Russia as a power, but a more of a modernization-driven idea of engagement. And so for Medvedev, the interest that Russia must protect in foreign policy must have to do with modernization, which is why he coined this phrase of modernization alliances. And in one of his State of the Union addresses, he plainly said that he's not interested in foreign policy that is not related to modernization. Foreign policy must be about creating opportunities for Russia's economic modernization alliances are again alliances with whom? Not with North Korea, right? Because North Korea is not exactly a source of technology for Russia, and he wants technology. He wants Russia to diversify away from its energy potential to create what he called smart economy. So that too is a Westernist move, which is why he traveled to Silicon Valley in California, which is why he wanted to reshape and create technoparks in Skolkovo and create a new industry of Russia's knowledge-based economy. So that's another departure, and it's again shaped by an idea called Russia. An idea in this case shapes interests. That's what constructivism is about. Not all about, but to a great extent is about. And then now we are in a somewhat different era, with somewhat unpredictable results. It's an era of global instability. The crisis is on, it's not over. Russia is less affected by it than some other countries, but it is likely to be more affected as we continue. And so Putin, in this case, introduces a new idea, which is why I have it with question mark, state civilization. The idea that Russia is not only an independent great power, the idea is that Russia must maintain relatively close relationships with the outside world, including European partners, but it is also self-sufficient culture. This is new to Putin. This is not something that he was comfortable with even 2 years ago. You might recall that he called once the search for Russian national idea Старинная русская забава. So clearly this wasn't quite a compliment coming from him. It was a way in some ways to ridicule these attempts to create a new national idea. Now you see him trying to borrow from the language of civilizations, perhaps for political objectives, but maybe also in order to introduce something that will help Russia to mobilize its potential, its creative potential, and reveal its economy. That remains to be seen. So that's just to give you an idea of what constructivism is about, and I want to spend the rest of the time, we have until 4:40, right? So we have another 50 minutes. And you stop me at any point if you have any questions, any clarification questions you want to ask. I'll be happy to do so. But in the meantime, let's move forward to Russia and Asia. That's the first traditional identity debate. Russia, of course, initially was extremely Eurocentric. It has seen itself as a part of European countries, sometimes consort of European powers. It expanded to Siberia and Far East with the idea of becoming geopolitically self-sufficient and with the idea of exploiting resources. Frankly, if you remember how, for instance, Ivan the Terrible expanded, Ivan the Fourth. It was largely about controlling Siberian resources at the time. There was Yermak and then Vida. Also was particularly interested in developing the resource, for resource reasons, the area. And this debate between Westernizers and Slavophiles is very much a European debate. Right? They were different only in emphasis. Westernizers felt inferior to Europe, Slavophiles felt superior to Europe, but they still felt that they were Europeans. It's just that we are better than the rest of Europe, but we are still Europeans. So that's the debate between the two groups about Russia in Europe, not in Asia. And both were fearful of Asia, both were referring to Asia routinely as barbaric and backward. I'll give you one example of Vladimir Solovyov, who was an extremely prominent member of Russia's intellectual discourses and debates in the late 19th century. He was also one of the founding fathers of Russia's religious renaissance. But he spoke as a westernizer. When he threatened Russia with a yellow peril, that's the expression that he coined, and he was very much afraid of Asia, and he spoke on behalf of many when he described these threats. Then there were other debates, and I'll talk to you briefly about Pan-Slavism and Leontiev and Vostochniki specifically. Why they're significant? Well, because they are sort of turning towards Asia. They're moving from the early Russia's preoccupation with Europe, and they are turning, maybe not in the way that you would like them to, but they are turning towards Asia. Danilevsky, Konstantin Danilevsky, you have heard this name before, haven't you? He was not the founding father of Eurasianism, as he sometimes is represented in Russia. He had nothing to do with Eurasianism, really. The only reason why he's used for that is because he introduced the concept of social and cultural types, historical cultural types. And Eurasianists want to see Russia as a special cultural type. But he was really a pan-Slavist more than anything else. He wanted to introduce the idea of Russia as a new pan-Slavic cultural type. We argued, are you familiar with the argument by Samuel Huntington about clash of civilizations? It has been around, right? So in that argument, Huntington formulated some 6 or 7 civilizations, largely based on religious lines. And to Danilevsky, and of course Danilevsky wrote more than a century before Huntington, to him there were 10 types of civilizations. And Romano-Germanic type of Europe was only one. He wants to discard the ambitions of Western civilization as the only one that shapes the world and the rest of the world will follow us, right? That kind of discourse. He says you're only one of 10. And us, we will develop the 11th type, the 11th civilization. And he also says that progress is not unidimensional, it's multidimensional, that we are trying to build not общечеловеческие ценности. It's funny that Gorbachev used the same term at a later stage, but we are building what he calls все человеческие ценности. We are part of все человечество rather than общее человечество. Why the difference? Well, because общее человечество is still the Western concept, he feels, in which the West, the Roman-Germanic type, will impose its values, and все человечество is simply diversity. Diversity in which we all share from each other, we learn from each other. That's the idea. But then Leontiev, Konstantin Leontiev comes along with a very different idea of what Russia is. And he moves even farther away from Danilevsky, because for Leontiev what is essential is that Russia is Neo-Byzantine. Did I misspell it? Yes, I did. It should be Byzantine rather than Byzantine. So the idea is that Russia should borrow from the civilization that is no longer around because it fell to the Turks, and the Neo-Byzantine type is really distinct. It's not pan-Slavism that is interested in, and it should not be based on Slavic principles. It should be based on institutions of strong state, institutions of complete subordination of individual to state objectives, which is why he praises Asian values. He particularly values the Turkic state in China. And he says that pan-Slavism is a dangerous illusion, to say the least. He calls his book Byzantinism и Славянство. Previous answers, Славянство from the perspective of Byzantinism. And he was alone, so he didn't have that many follows at the time, but he proved to be influential nevertheless. Then those who also took the challenge of Asia more seriously were geographers, those who were involved in various geographic discoveries in the so-called inner Eurasia, Tianshansky, Przewarsky, all those who worked for Russian Geographic Society, they were Vostochniki. They called themselves Vostochniki. And at the time, writers began to turn to Asia as well. Even people such as Dostoevsky, Fyodor Dostoevsky, who of course said that Europe is our second motherland, he also wrote in his diaries that it is time for us to realize that we are not Europeans. We will never be accepted by Europeans. As emotional as it was an acknowledgement that Russia was more appreciative of influences from non-West as well. So that's in a nutshell, a very cursory summary for you of Russia's Asian engagement. The next one is Western debate, the Westernist period. If you turn to the next slide. That's the that's the third question for you. And of course, Westernism is a debate. Zapadnichество has roots, and you are familiar with the pro-Western orientation argument that Russia is essentially a European country, that Russia should not have a special Asian strategy, that it should in fact try to solve the issues in concert with the West. Andrei Kozyrev did not want to participate in Asian institutions and forums. It was more important for him that Russia join the European Union and even NATO at the time. And the roots, of course, are quite significant in Russian history. The first Westernizers were not liberal. Remember that Russia was a part of Europe even before liberalism emerged as a movement. Alexander I, who defeated Napoleon and presided over the Congress of Vienna, was not liberal. He had some liberal ideas, but by the time the war with Napoleon was over, he turned away from those ideas and he wanted to create an alliance of autocracies. He wanted to protect European values of monarchy, of Christianity, which is why that alliance was called the Holy Alliance, right? Священный Союз. So that too is Westernism. And then, of course, Westernism changed in the 19th century when Russia began to westernize with more liberal standards as they were introduced again by Western Europe. Alexander II liberated the Serbs, and all these great reforms moved in this direction, and they inspired a new generation of westernizers in Russia. And some proxies of westernizers existed within the Soviet system as well. I'll give you just one example of Maxim Litvinov, who was the second foreign minister of the Soviet Union, who tried to assemble the coalition against Hitler. Unsuccessfully, but he did work hard to join Western institutions. He took Russia to the League of Nations, and he worked very hard to get the West to cooperate with the Soviet Union. And because of the mutual mistrust on the part of Stalin on the one hand and the West on the other, it didn't work. But remember that Litvinov was also among those who was very critical of the West for trying to build relationships with him. When Munich took place, for instance, Litvinov was the first to say, "You prepared? Now it's Czechoslovakia that is divided. Poland will be next." And he was right. Then, of course, that tradition existed. Without that tradition, Gorbachev would have not appeared in the political scene. And Andrei Kozyrev and Boris Yeltsin is a new breed of post-Western, post-Soviet Western. And there are westernizers under Vladimir Putin as well. And as we said, Putin is an interesting mix of statism and westernism himself. Let me talk a little bit about Eurasianism as well, because I do want us to move forward to the Euro-Pacific country, identity of Euro-Pacific country as well. The next one, please. Eurasianism is the revival of Russia's Asia thinking. It's the view of Russia as a culturally Asian and anti-Western. And Russia is introduced here, at least in classical Eurasianism, as a land-based civilization with strong ties in Asia and must involve the Slavic Turkic community as Trubetskoy represented. And the origins of this philosophy, of course, this is the early 20th century. This is a post-revolutionary intellectuals, some linguists and philosophers in immigration created this movement, but the origins are in Russia's traditionalist philosophy that viewed Russia's values as fundamentally different and even superior to those of the West. And I gave you a couple of examples. One is Primakov, that viewed Russia as a part of Eurasia rather than the European continent. And Vladimir Putin, one could argue, we can talk about this, is also changing his perception of what Russia and Russia's identity should be by turning increasingly away from Europe, from Western Europe, and towards China. So this is where there are two different ways, two different possibilities how to think about Eurasia. That's slide 12. One is pragmatic and another one is ideological. And I say here Sinophiles as well, because frequently Russian Eurasianists are also very much in favor of building relationships with China. And the difference here is that pragmatic Eurasianists emphasize Russia's political cooperation with China and Asian nations. But it is pragmatic in the sense that still the priority for them is sovereignty, is their own geopolitical standing. Whereas for ideological Eurasianists, and quite frequently they are associated with Russian Communist Party theories, what Russia should be doing is not simply building geopolitical alliances against the United States, but it should be also borrowing Chinese values, Chinese traditions, Chinese institution of strong statehood. So it's about values and not just political sovereignty. The next slide is just to tell you, just to give you an idea that, of course, Westernizers and Sinophiles, they're not separated by Chinese wall. They are in relationships with each other, and sometimes they can borrow from each other. So it's more complex that I'm presenting to you. And Vladimir Putin himself is an example. He started as a Westernizer, and now I think he's moving away from that discourse. What are some of the problems with these discourses? And that's the next slide. There are both theoretical problems and there are practical implications of how the relatively rigid application of these images can create practical problems. And one obvious problem is that they are really extreme. They represent extremes of Russia's civilizational identity, and therefore they are inadequately described Russia's roots. Russia has some roots in Asia, but it also has very strong tradition and strong roots in Europe. So it's very hard to describe Russia as either or, right? And in a rapidly changing world, today's world, these cultural perspectives are very limited. We do need to be aware of these ideas. We do need for Russia to understand what Russia is trying to introduce as its idea, but that does not mean that its idea is going to be framed as either or. And I think we now have examples of how commitment, relatively rigid commitment to Westernism on the one hand, to Eurasianism on the other, did Russia disservice. Andrei Kozyrev's Westernizers period, Westernizers diplomacy, didn't serve Russia very well. The idea was really to gain as much distance as possible from China and isolate Australia in alliance with Western nations, primarily because China is not a democracy. And that is not the Western values. We are committed now to a very different worldview. And so one of the reasons why Kozyrev wanted to have nothing to do with China at the time was the Tiananmen Square, right, 1991. That caused enormous uproar and condemnation in the world press, and Andrei Kozyrev did not feel that he should have ignored this. He should have developed this relationship at the expense of those with the West. And in Primakov's example is just the opposite. This was the attempt to build Eurasian system in the former Soviet Union. The notion that he used was the notion of integration, integrating or reintegrating the former Soviet space, the Eurasian Union, Eurasian community. And globally, he wanted to build an axis with China and India against the United States. Neither one nor the second really worked for multiple reasons. He was trying to replicate the strategy of Chancellor Gorchakov after the Crimean War, but Gorchakov labored under the multipolar world. He was able ultimately to bring Russia back to the Black Sea and restore the fleet, and to revive Russia's role as a great power. And Primakov had to deal with the unipolar world, essentially. Neither China nor India were interested in joining that kind of anti-American coalition. They had their own states, they had their own interdependencies. So it didn't work. Couldn't work. Now let's move forward. Ignore the slide 15 and go to the next 16. Thank you. So that means that these isms, so to speak, are quite limited. And Russia is looking for somewhat more sophisticated perspective on Asia and wants to synthesize from different cultural poles. Intellectuals did have some of these ideas around even in the 90s. There are a couple of examples for you. One is Alexander Panarin's notion of civilized Eurasianism, in which case Russia would be building similar to the West values, but it will have its own distinct Eurasian interest as well. And Lev Pavlovsky's idea of Euro-Vostok, Euro-East, is also an attempt to bridge the difference by emphasizing that Russia is in Europe, but Russia is a very eastern part of Europe. Vostok in Europe, right? East in Europe, Euro-Vostok. But the idea is the same, to connect to those Western and cultural values while preserving Russia's historical ties. And another idea that is introduced, and I want to discuss with you a little bit longer, we actually have how many minutes? 10 minutes left, is the idea of Euro-Pacific Russia. That's the next slide. It was, as I said, introduced by Dmitry Penin in one of his articles, and he argued that Russia's key relations are in Asia-Pacific region. They should not be neglected. But the meaning of this concept is still quite Eurocentric in many respects. Russia remains culturally European. Russia turns to Asia for economic and business opportunities, much like Russia was turning to Asia for resources before. And Russia wants to contain China. The argument that he makes is in fact pro-Japanese argument. He says that Japan is our next partner in the Asia Pacific. Japan will do for us what Germany did from Europe. Now that we are somewhat better integrated with Europe, it is thanks to Germans' investments, it's thanks to Germans embracing us as a nation. So that's what we should expect from Japanese if we are smart. And that is something that will help us also to contain the rising China. And related to this, we will be able, Lenin didn't try to in this particular article, but he wrote it elsewhere, we will be able to rebuild our relations with the Euro-Atlantic civilization. It will be continuity, if you will. Europe, European Union on the one hand, United States on the other, and Russia in Asia Pacific will be the third link in the chain. That's the idea. So it's overall pro-Western idea with some statist overtones, which is why some statists, some державники such as Vyacheslav Nikonov came out supporting this idea. And you can ignore the next slides. Go to the 19. That's a critique of Euro-Pacific Russia. That's a critique specifically coming from one analyst of China in Russia, Australian analyst named Law, and he also finds that Russia still has a pro-Western agenda in its Asia-Pacific policies. He is also critical of this concept for Sino-centrism, I think unfairly, given that the Ukrainian really is pro-Japan rather than pro-China, which probably means that Russia is not really developing relationships as widely as extensively with non-Chinese powers. And his final critique is that Russia is still driven by politics rather than by economics. It's focused on status and institutions, and this is no way to engage the Asia-Pacific. That is probably at least partly fair criticism. If you go to the next slide, then you'll see that Russia, in terms of its social and economic development, is not where it should be if it wants to be politically successful in terms of becoming a geopolitical pole. The biggest poles here, and these are, if you can't read the chart, GDP size, then GDP per capita, the next column, and the last one is demographic, I think, yes, human resources, demographic potential. And Russia is not here, but its GDP size is really comparable not to China, not to Japan, but more to, particularly per capita, more to middle range powers. And we'll have plenty more of these statistics, so you will see where Russia fits in terms of these indicators. So really the emphasis on geopolitics, which is the critique of global law, is overstated. And if you go to the next slide, then this is a critique from Russia's westernizers and status of the same concept. Vladislav Inozemtsev, for example, has been critical of the idea for mostly on economic grounds. He said that the idea of building Euro-Pacific Russia as a bridge between Europe on the one hand and Asia on the other hand is not likely to work because the emphasis here is on land transportation. Russia will have to build many more railroads connecting Europe and Asia. We'll hit it. We're almost there. It's okay. But it's not likely to work. It's going to be too expensive, and overseas routes are more efficient. So let's rely on Arctic route rather than land. And Russia's state is frequently critical of this concept as well, because without strong state, it's hard to make it work, and the nation will be pulled in different directions. So I'm almost there. To conclude, Russian idea is changing. As you can see, it's shifting slowly, but it's shifting towards Asia Pacific. It's still work in progress. It's no longer either Eurasianism or Westernism. Putin is talking about relationships with Europe at the same time he's building the Eurasian Union as a bridge between Europe and Asia Pacific, and he's organizing Asia Pacific Summit, all at the same time. I think the message is that Russia has some distinct values to build on, but it's not easy to formulate a new identity. The only thing we can say now is that it is a transcontinental power with global emphasis, and how it will reshape its new image, it remains to be seen. Anything that I left unclear? Guys? Any questions? It's either a very good thing or very bad. All right, then let's take a break and meet for another lecture on the drivers of Russia's foreign policy in the Asia Pacific. The next one is I have the 450, right?